Hello guys, you're welcome to uComputing's YouTube channel. My name is Eugene, and in this video I'm going to take you through how you can set up a virtual network gateway, also known as a VPN gateway on Microsoft Azure. Now, what is a virtual network gateway? This service that we have on Azure allows you to connect your Microsoft Azure virtual network to your on-prem network. So basically, it's going to allow you to establish a communication between your on-prem devices and your Microsoft Azure resources like virtual machines over the public internet. But this whole process is encrypted using tunneling protocols like IKE, OpenSSL, SSTP, and so on and so forth. The configuration is quite lengthy, but I advise you to take your time and go through the step-by-step procedure I'm going to show you. It's going to be very easy and straightforward for you to do. Now, the first thing that you want to do if you want to set up a virtual network gateway is to make sure you have a virtual network. First of all, you have to have a virtual network. So I'm going to create a virtual network first by going to the virtual networks blade. If you're unable to find it in your portal menu, you can search for it here in the global search field over here. Now, I'm going to click on the create button here to create my virtual network. I'll need to select a subscription that this virtual network instance is going to be linked to. I only have one subscription in my Azure account, so I'm going to use my MSDN platform subscription. And then I will need a resource group to contain this my virtual network. Okay, I do have a resource group over here, a couple of them, but I'm going to create a new one for this demo. I'm going to call it VPN demo. And then I'm going to give it a name. I'm going to call this VPN Gateway 01. So the next thing I need to do is to specify my region. So I'm going to go ahead and pick a region. I'm going to use the East US region for this my virtual network. So this is going to create a resource group with the name VPN Demo and place my virtual network instance in it for me. I'm going to go next. It's going to give me an option to specify an IP address range. I'm going to stick with the default, and then the option has also been provided for us to specify a subnet address range. I'm going to just leave the default, go next here, leave the default on the security options, go next to tags, go next. It's going to just validate my inputs, and if everything goes right, it gives me a green check mark. I'm going to click on create here to begin my VNet deployment. I'm going to click on go to resource. You can also pass through the VNet blade here in your portal menu to get to this resource. I'm going to just quickly check and make sure everything is all right with my VNet. Looks like everything is good. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is to make sure I create a resource on Microsoft Azure that is going to be hooked to this VNet, like a virtual machine, because at the end of the day, I want to establish a communication between resources like virtual machines on Azure and then my on-prem devices. So I'm going to create a Linux Azure VM real quick and then connect it to this virtual network just for demonstration. So I'm going to go to virtual machines here, and as you can see, I already have one VM there. I'm not going to use that. I'm going to click on create and go for Azure virtual machine. This is going to initialize a create a virtual machine wizard. Okay, same procedure. It asks me to specify the subscription I want to link this virtual machine instance to. I'm going to stick with the default, and then I'm going to pick my VPN demo resource group. I'm going to make sure everything is in the same resource group so that it becomes easy for me to clean afterwards. The next thing I'm going to do is to just specify a name for my VM. I'm going to call this Linux VM 01. I'm going to leave it in the East US region. I'm not going to enable any redundancy options, so I'll specify no infrastructure redundancy required, because this is just for a demo. If you're doing it in a production environment, you want to make sure you have some redundancy options enabled to ensure you have enough fault tolerance. I'm going to go for the standard security type. I'm going to use Ubuntu server. Okay, leave it at the 64-bit architecture. The allocated size for my VM is just okay. This is going to run in a text mode, so 3.5 GB RAM is enough. I'm not going to use an SSH public key. I'm going to just use a username and password to connect to this Linux VM. So I'm going to specify a name here. I'm going to call this username here uadmin, and then specify a password. Okay, now I'm going to make sure the SSH port is opened on my firewall. So I'll leave the default because that's the port number you're going to use to connect to this Linux VM after the deployment. So I'm going to click on next to disks over here. Now you can choose any disk type that you want. I'm not going to use premium SSD because it's much more expensive, so I'm going to use a standard SSD, but this is the best if you're going to do it in a production environment. Okay, I'm going to leave the default, go next here. I've already done a demo video on how to create virtual machines on Microsoft Azure, so if you want detailed explanation you can check it out on my channel. Now this is one of the most important areas, okay, because I want to establish a communication between my on-prem devices and in this demo a virtual machine on Azure. What I'm going to do is that I'm going to make sure this virtual machine that I'm creating is connected to the VPN Gateway VNet. Okay, so you remember we created this one earlier on, so I'm going to select VPN Gateway 01 VNet to be the virtual network for my Linux VM. If you do not select the right virtual network after your configuration, your on-prem devices cannot communicate with this Azure VM. I'm going to leave the default over here. Go next to management, leave the default here, go next, go next, go next again. It's going to check my inputs. If everything is all right, it's going to give me a green check mark. Yeah, says everything passed. So I'm going to go ahead and create by clicking on this create button over here. This is going to create a Linux VM on Azure and then hook it to my VPN Gateway VNet for me. All right, so the deployment is complete. I'm going to click here to go to the Linux VM 01, which is connected to the VNet I'm going to be using for this VPN Gateway. So it shows that the virtual network for this Linux VM is the VPN Gateway VNet. Okay, so I'm going to connect to it by clicking on connect here. I'm going to go to SSH. I'm just preparing this machine so that after the creation of the VPN Gateway we can use it for testing. So I did not use a private key, so I'm going to just copy this and then launch a regular command prompt from my host machine. What I'm going to do to connect to this Linux VM is by doing SSH space the username at the public IP of the Linux VM on Azure. I'm going to press enter here. I'm going to type yes here to approve the connection and type my password to authenticate. Looks like everything is good. It's connecting me to my Linux VM on Azure. Everything looks good. I'm going to check the IP address. As you can see, the IP address for the Linux VM is right here. Right. This is 10.1.0.4. It's coming from the subnet within the VNet that we created when you go to the VPN Gateway VNet on the Azure portal. When you look at the subnet, it tells you the subnet is having a range of 10.1, so that is the reason why we are getting an IP of 10.1.0.4 for this Linux VM. It's hooked to the subnet on this VNet. Okay, so everything is good. If you want to check again, you can just use ifconfig. But one thing about ifconfig, let's do ifconfig here. That is how we check IP addresses on Linux machines. When you do it for the first time, it's going to tell you to install NetTools. All you need to do is just highlight this command that has been given here, press enter, right click to paste, and then press enter to install the NetTools. Then you can get a chance to use ifconfig to check the IP address of your Linux VMs on Azure. Okay, so I'm going to do ifconfig here, and then it tells me Ethernet 0 is having an IP address, the same IP address that was mentioned earlier on over here. It's confirmed over here. That is a local IP address of this Linux VM on Azure. So everything looks good. But what we want to do is to establish a communication between an on-prem device and then this Linux VM. Okay, I have an on-prem device. I'm going to fire it up. Okay, so my on-prem device is running on VMware Workstation. The most important thing is that you need to make sure your on-prem device has internet access, because the communication between the Azure endpoint and then your on-prem devices through the VPN Gateway will be done over the public network, which is the internet. So you need to make sure the machine has internet. If you're using VMware Workstation for this demo, this is how you get internet access into the virtual machine. You can just double click the network adapter here and then switch to either network address translation or bridge directly to your physical network. I'm going to use bridge. Okay, after a while you should get internet access in the VM. And if you're doing this on an on-prem device, obviously on-prem devices already have internet access through the company network, so you don't need to do this. I'm going to wait and check to make sure, yes, the internet access is up and running. So if everything works right, we should be able to communicate with our Azure VM, which is this Linux VM over here. This Linux VM. Now we have discovered that the local IP address for this Linux VM is 10.1.0.4. Just going to test communication between the on-prem device and then this Azure VM. I'm going to press Window key plus R to open the run prompt, type CMD to launch the command prompt on my on-prem device, and we're going to do a simple ping. I'm going to ping 10.1.0.4, and as you can see, it's not going through because there is no connection, right? So we want to establish that connection by creating a VPN gateway. Okay, so to do that, we need to create a virtual network gateway, also known as a VPN gateway. All right, so I'm going to go to my virtual network gateway blade. If you're unable to find it within your portal menu, you can go ahead and then search for virtual network gateway or VPN gateway from here. And this is how the option looks like. So I'm going to click on virtual network gateway and then click on create over here. It's going to give me a wizard, and then every time you're creating a resource on Azure, you have to link it to a subscription. So automatically it picks my MSDN platform subscription. I'm going to go ahead and then specify the VNet. Now the VNets are detected or preloaded from the region that you select. So if you're on the wrong region, if you try to see, I try to select a VNet, there's nothing here. Okay, so you need to make sure you are at the right region. You remember we created our virtual network for our Azure resources and placed it in the East US region. So when I switch to East US, it gives me the chance to pick a virtual network. As you can see, my VPN Gateway virtual network is here. This is what the Azure VM is hooked to. So I'm going to click that, and then it picks that automatically, and then it also picks the resource group automatically, and it tells us it was derived from the virtual network I selected. So I'm going to go ahead and give this virtual network gateway a name. I'm going to call this VPN Gateway 01. Okay, let me use this cache name here, VPN Gateway 01. Okay, it's going to be in the East US region, and then you have two gateway types. You can use express route, which is a high performance gateway type, or you can use VPN. Okay, and then we have the two VPN types on Azure. We have route based and then a policy based, but the policy based is kind of restricted to IKE version 1. So if you intend to use IKE version 2 or other tunneling protocols, it's always recommended to use the route based. So I'm going to go for route based, and then it gives us an option to specify the kind of SKUs that we want. This is going to determine how many concurrent connections you can make to your VPN gateway, how much bandwidth is going to be allocated to you. And this is the least expensive, the basic SKU. Okay, so if you don't want to spend so much money on your VPN gateway, this is what you have to go for. The higher you go, the less, the more expensive it becomes. But I'm going to stick with this one over here. And depending on the SKU that you select, it can take up to about 45 minutes for it to finish the deployment process. So when you finish and you go for the create button and it's taking quite some time, probably is because of the SKU that you selected. Even with this SKU, from experience, this VPN Gateway 2AC SKU can take about 15 minutes to 17 minutes to finish deployment. So you have to be a little patient. Okay, my VPN Gateway VNet has been selected, and this is going to create a gateway subnet address for me automatically. This is okay. I'm going to let it be, and then I need to create a public IP address. This is what it's going to be the external interface the remote client are going to use to connect to this VPN gateway. So I'm going to give it a name. All I need to do is to give it a name. So I'm going to call this VPN public IP, and spaces are not allowed. So if you want a space, you have to use either underscore or hyphen. Okay, I'm going to let the default be, and then it gives me the option to specify an availability zone. I'm going to use availability zone 1 on the East US region, and then leave the defaults for enable active mode and configure BGP at disabled. Okay, I'm going to go next to tags. It's going to check all my input. Looks like everything is good, and I'm going to go ahead and click on create here to begin the deployment process. If all the inputs that you provided are correct, and if you selected the SKU that I specified, it should take about 15 minutes to 17 minutes to finish provisioning. So I'm going to pause the video and wait for it to complete. If it's taking longer than usual, do not be worried. Just be patient and play the waiting game. Everything is going to be all right after a couple of minutes. Okay, the deployment is complete, as you can see, and it took about 17 minutes to 18 minutes to finish. So if yours is taking a longer time, do not worry, just allow it to finish, and then you can proceed with the next step. Okay, the next step is to configure a point-to-site configuration. So I'm going to go to the resource. You can click here to go to the resource, or if you have already added virtual network gateways to the favorites on your portal menu, it should be here. I'm going to click on this button here to go to the VPN gateway. And then this is where things get interesting. You can configure a point-to-site VPN configuration, a site-to-site configuration, or a VNet to VNet configuration. In this demo, I'm going to do a point-to-site configuration. So I'm going to click on point-to-site here, and then click on configure now. It gives me the option to specify an address pool, and this can be any address pool. It doesn't matter. It's going to be routed to the VNet automatically. So I'm going to use class B network address over here, 172.16.0.0 / side annotation of 16 to be the address pool. This is the range that the VPN gateway is going to use to assign my remote client IP addresses. So let's move on to the next step, which is the tunneling protocol type. Okay, we have a couple. We have OpenVPN, SSL, IKE version 2, and so on and so forth. Okay, OpenVPN or SSL is only allowed to be authenticated against Azure Active Directory. Okay, so if you select, let's say, a different VPN VPN tunneling protocol like IKE version 2 and you want to use Azure AD to perform authentication, it's not going to work. It tells you here that Azure AD authentication is supported only when OpenVPN is selected as the tunneling protocol. So I want to keep things simple. So we're going to use Azure AD to perform the authentication. We are not going to use certificates because it makes the configuration quite complex for some people. So I'm going to go for OpenVPN, and then I'm going to select my authentication type to be Azure Active Directory. We are not going to use certificates. And this is one of the simplest ways that you can authenticate your VPN client. And I'm going to show you how. Okay. Now, this is where most people get stuck with point-to-site configuration, okay, because you don't know actually what you're supposed to put here, okay. But it gives us an advice over here that whatever you're going to put here for the tenant ID has to start with https:// blah blah blah. It gives us a sample over here, right? So basically you're supposed to start with logon.microsoftonline.com/ your tenant ID. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and show you a help that you can use on Microsoft Learn. Okay, now when I go to this URL over here that I have bookmarked, and when you go to this Microsoft Learn page, you're going to find a help on option 3 here under configure point-to-site settings. All the instructions are here. It tells you that if you're going to set up a tenant ID and you are using Azure Public, which is what I am using, this is what you're supposed to use. Okay, now we have other Azure environment like Azure Government, Azure China, Azure Germany. So if you are doing this for a different Azure environment, you have to make sure you specify the right one. But the general Azure platform that we all use is the Azure Public. So I'm going to copy this URL over here, and it's saying that after you copy this, you need to append it with your Azure AD tenant ID. Okay, so let's do that. I'm going to paste that here, and then I need to append this with my tenant ID. So I'm going to right click on my Azure AD blade here in my portal menu, open the Azure AD blade in a new tab because I don't want to mess up this configuration. It's going to give me the option to sign in again, hopefully. Okay, locks in. Okay, once the new tab is opened for the Azure Active Directory, takes you to the overview of the Azure AD tenant, and this is where you have your tenant ID. So you have to copy this and then append it to the URL. This is how it's supposed to be, right? And then you need to check the audience. The audience also has something that we call an application ID. So the same page, when you scroll down, there is an application ID for the audience for Azure Public here. You need to copy this, and then you need to paste it here. Once it's pasted, you need to also specify an issuer URL or address, and the information is available. So the issuer URL, you got to copy this with the /, and then you paste it here, and then afterwards what you need to do is to append it with your Azure AD tenant ID. Okay, so I'm going to copy the tenant ID from here and then paste it here in front of the / for this issuer URL. Now they gave us a caution over here that you don't have to miss. Okay, when you scroll down, it tells us this is how everything is supposed to be, and you're supposed to bring a / in front of the Azure AD tenant ID. Okay, if you omit that, it's going to give you an error when you save it. So what I need to do here is to click in this input field for the issuer. I'm going to use the right arrow key to press and press and press, and then I'll bring a / here. Okay, and once this is done, what you need to do is to grant administrator consent for Azure VPN client applications. Okay, so you need to just click this. So when you click this, normally if you haven't done this for your Azure AD tenant before, it's going to bring a dialog box and ask you to check a couple of boxes and then just go agree with whatever that is there. Once it's done, it redirects you back into the Azure portal. But I've done that for my Azure AD already, so as you can see, it never showed up, but it's very important. You need to do that. Okay, once this is done, all you need to do is to go for the save button here, and after saving, the download VPN client configuration files will be ready. Okay, so I'm going to click on save here. It's going to take a couple of seconds or minutes to save. Okay, so the point-to-site configuration has been saved successfully. So I'm going to close this notification area, and then this thing here, the VPN client configuration has to be active. So I'm going to refresh the Azure portal, go reload here. Okay, so the download VPN client configuration files are ready. I'm going to click on download here. It's going to take a couple of seconds before the download begins. Okay, it's downloaded. I'm going to just open files here. Okay, and then extract this. The only one we need is the Azure VPN actually. So I'm going to extract this to my desktop. This is the only thing I need. And then additionally, I'll need an Azure AD VPN client. So I've also provided a URL for you guys. So I'm going to open a new tab here. It's going to take me to a page that I can use to download an Azure AD VPN client software. It takes quite a while to load, so you have to be patient. Okay, so the Azure VPN client web address is opened, and it gives us a download button over here. This is the only stuff we need, in addition to our VPN client configuration files that we just downloaded. Okay, now it gives us instructions over here on how to install this VPN client. Should in case you double click the MSI X bundle file and it fails or it doesn't run, they are provided a PowerShell script that you can use to do so. Okay, so should in case you face any challenges installing it, there are instructions over here on this page. So I'm going to go for the download button here. Okay, after the download is complete, I'm going to open this zipped folder over here, and all the files that I need for the VPN client is ready. So I'm going to press Ctrl E here to select everything. I'm going to right click and extract it, or say copy to. You can always copy it from your regular Windows zipped folder if you're not using this particular archiving software. Okay, so I'm going to go to open and then create a folder on the desktop, and then go for the OK button. I'm going to go OK here. So it's going to extract everything and place it in a new folder for me on my desktop. I'm going to minimize this. So I have my Azure VPN configuration files from the Azure portal, and then I also have my Azure VPN client files over here. Okay, so I need to pick up these two things over here and distribute it to my on-prem devices. Okay, so I'm going to use this machine over here on-prem. I'm going to paste these files here. I'm going to do one more time. I'm going to do the copy one more time, and then paste it here in my VMware workstation on my Windows 10 machine. Okay, so I have these files over here. First thing I need to do, I have my Azure VPN configuration files over here, and then I also have my Azure VPN client software over here. Okay, I need to install the software first, so I'm going to double click this folder, go here, right click on the MSI X bundle file, and go open. You can also double click to open it, and it's going to give you a wizard. You can leave this check mark on. It's going to just launch the application once the installation is complete, and go for the install button. It's going to take a couple of seconds, and then it's going to complete. Then we have to just continue with the connection. It can take quite some time for the VPN client software to install, so if it's taking quite some time, just be patient and just wait for it to complete. Okay, once it's done, the next thing that you need to do, once you have your internet connection in place, you need to import the VPN client configuration files from what we received from the Azure portal, which is this one over here. So I'm going to go to my desktop and then open the Azure VPN and pick this Azure VPN configuration. What it's going to do is that it's going to preload my connection details. So I'm going to go ahead and save here. Okay, it looks like the configuration is ready. Looks like we have some small error over here, but we're going to figure it out. What is actually causing this problem? It's no problem. I'm going to go ahead and click on connect here, and it's going to load a credential prompt for me to provide an Azure AD username and password. Okay, so because we specified that we're going to use Azure AD to authenticate, that's the reason why we have this option. So at this point, what you need to do is that you need to go to your Azure AD, and then you need to make sure you have a user account in place that you're going to use to perform this authentication. Okay, so I'm going to use this Scott user account over here. I'm going to quickly check if everything with the Scott user account is okay. Account is enabled, everything is okay. I'm going to go ahead and copy the UPN for Scott and then paste it in here. I'm going to go next here and then provide a password for Scott and go sign in. If everything goes right, the authentication should go through and we should be connected to our virtual network gateway on Azure. This can take a couple of minutes, so if it's taking some time, you just have to be patient and then play the waiting game. Looks like everything is set. The authentication passed. So I'm going to click done here. The connection is in progress. You can see the status of the connection here. Great. So this was just a warning message, I guess. Shows that we are connected to VPN Gateway 01 VNet, and we obtain an IP address from the class B range. So everything is cool here. Now, when we click on this network icon over here, it shows that we have a VPN connection over here, right? Let's test communicating with our Linux VM. You remember our Linux VM, this guy over here, Linux VM 1. We're going to test connection to it one more time. I'm going to press the up arrow, use the same command, and we are getting a reply from the Linux VM. So this shows that the communication between our on-prem Windows 10 machine over here and our Linux VM has been established. I hope this was helpful to you. Thank you very much for joining me today. If this video was helpful, kindly subscribe to our YouTube channel and share it with your friends. I'll see you in the next video.